want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the work you do in helping to create thriving, diverse, and inclusive company cultures. To kick this off, I actually want to ask Candice a question. We've heard this phrase, it actually came up on the panel I did last night, bringing one's full self to work, showing up with the entirety of one's being and self. It's sort of sad that anyone would have to do something less than that. Can you talk about what that phrase means and some of the ways that we inhibit people from actually fully expressing at work?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I'll start with a learning moment of my own in terms of what that means. So I work at Pinterest. I work at a pretty casual tech company. And I was talking to a young black man who was an employee, and he talked about making sure that he thought about how he dressed every day when he went into work, right? So the hoodie, the sweatshirt, et cetera. And by the way, he had just joined the company and essentially said, this is something I think about as I get dressed in the mornings, showing my badge, right? And making sure that it's visible. And that to me was a really, really powerful moment. And this is someone who had shared some experiences of working at other companies and how that is something he learned he needed to do as he walked into our company. Another example is I was speaking with a number of individuals where English isn't their first language, and they were talking about how by the end of the day, that code switching of needing to speak in English, translate different terms, it gets exhausting by the end of the day. And so I asked, well, how do you cope with that? And this individual said, I just speak less towards the end of the day. I also have my own experiences in terms of my affect, my style, and thinking about how I need to adjust and code switch in certain meetings because I want to make sure that the people I'm speaking with can hear the things that I'm saying. And so that's how I define bringing one's whole self to work, is if you're not covering some aspect of who you are, your personality, how you like to express your style, at the expense that it can negatively impact your career.
Yeah, I think the tax of sort of having to manage that and sort of contain and present oneself is like this extra energy that people have to expend that it gets in the way of the work. So what, and this is for everyone, I want, this is not a shy group, but I'm wondering if everyone can jump in and sort of share what can we collectively do to eliminate that tax, to allow and invite people to express fully at work? What are the things that leaders, allies, and companies can do to create a culture where this isn't the status quo?
So I can talk a little bit about that. Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy. And so I think that one of the things I try to share with folks around me is this idea of leveraging your privilege as an ally for those who may not have as much opportunity. So that means recognizing that you are privileged and then leveraging it to aid somebody else. So for example, if I'm in a space, in a room, and as a gentleman who's kind of the person who's kind of always called out to talk or is always speaking, that gentleman could then say, you know what, I'd love to hear what Nancy has to say. Or maybe not even speak in that meeting, right? And give everyone else another opportunity. So what ways can you step aside from your own privilege and help someone else with it, because your privilege isn't going anywhere, right? And so I find that my sponsors and allies and supporters who have helped me manage my space around working at Google or Uber or Cisco, IBM, it's always been those folks who have said, you know what, let me use my own personal privilege to make sure that Nancy is set up in a way that she's not falling behind. What I would say a lot of our legacy doesn't produce a lot of information for us, so I feel like it's always great to have folks who can help out in that capacity.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. In particular, if you're the only person in the room, it's really hard to be vocal about your own needs. And having others be the ones to come to you and sort of use their privilege, as you said, to help make you more comfortable, to open up opportunities for you is critical. And one thing I'd add as well is that when you're sort of in a company context, you need to understand that different people have different perspectives, different communication styles, and you need to make sure that you understand what their preferences are and not just assume. Personally, I've been in situations with my team where I ask them, for example, how do you like to receive positive feedback? How do you want me to praise you? And my assumption is, of course, you'd want me to praise you in public. And some people have told me, actually, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Like, would you know, and in particular, if it's something that I feel is just me doing my job. So don't just assume what others want or how they want to communicate. Make sure you have those conversations so that you can better serve them as a leader.
So Jules, just for the record, I want you to praise me lavishly and extensively. Moving on. But a question for everyone again. But Candice, I think you mentioned this as we were prepping. Calling someone out and saying, Mary, you've been very quiet. You know, what do you have to say on the topic? You know, are there ways to sort of create the environment without conspicuously otherizing people with the differences?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, there was this one employee, a friend of mine, who was leading some of our unconscious bias conversations, and she said, well, the way that I like to participate in a meeting is, you know, I kind of dread when they're like, anybody who hasn't said anything want to speak up now? She's like, that's not my moment. She prefers to get an agenda in advance, and then she will weigh in after the meeting, and that's just her style. It's just as effective. And so we actually did this study at Pinterest where we looked at managers that were exceptionally inclusive. How we did that was we basically looked at how managers were rated by their employees, and we pulled out managers that were just across the board getting very high scores around listening to input of that's different from their own, different opinions. I should mention that there were no patterns amongst these managers from a gender perspective or even an underrepresented background, but what made them different is that they sought out input from their individual employees. What do you need from me? How do you like to communicate? What was also really interesting is that they were very humble. So they were willing to talk about mistakes that they had made. So if you are a leader and you talk about that time that you did that really embarrassing thing last week, whether you're a CEO or you're a manager, that actually opens the door for people across a wide variety of backgrounds to actually come to you and disclose if they themselves are managing or code switching.
And do you mean sort of being vulnerable with respect specifically to diversity and, you know, things where you put your foot in your mouth or made mistakes in that, or just more generally acknowledging that you make mistakes?
More generally.
Yeah.
More generally. I mean, I do think that it takes building up some trust to be able to say, and there's a lot of fear, you know, talking about diversity and a lot of fear of saying the wrong thing, and I try to disarm individuals around that because intent is what really matters. But yeah, even if you just said, you know what, oops, the other day, you know, I posted in that Slack channel and I meant to speak to John, but I wrote hi to everyone, you know, those examples carry over into this conversation.
And how much of this is sort of ad hoc point solutions? A lot of what we've been talking about is sort of individual to individual, or maybe manager or meeting leader to the others in the meeting. How much of this can and should be sort of institutionalized so that it sort of becomes bigger than the instance that's playing out in front of you, but sort of gets recorded into the company's culture?
Well, I can speak to that from a product standpoint. So I primarily help tech companies look at how their products work across the globe in different cultural subsets. So imagine here we are in Silicon Valley or San Francisco building technology for the rest of the world, right? And so what are the implications when you are designing for a westernized society and introducing it to a global product, right? And so really trying to shift this mindset from looking at things from this westernized first perspective, but by looking at things from a global first perspective. What that means is, you know, making sure you hear the voices of others. And so I have teams in Brazil and Mexico, in India, that I've hired, have trained in usability and human factors, engineering, and learning how to make sure that you are incorporating all these other underrepresented voices into your product. And so I've been able to help companies really look at how to systematically make change by making sure that they have these checkpoints in at least 2 underrepresented spaces.
Can you share an anecdote, like of all the markets that Uber operates in, what is sort of the most unlike what you might find out on O'Farrell Street out here? What is...
Actually, it's probably surprising to some folks to know that in Uber in other countries takes cash, right? So that was not something originally built into the app, but let me break that down for you. So imagine if you don't have cash, you have to have a credit card, right? What types of folks have credit cards across the globe? Even in places like South America where there are credit cards available, not all the credit cards have those 3-digit pins on the back. So now you have created this product that's really just a luxury product, but by introducing this aspect to it that was cash in places like India and places across Africa, what we saw was that we stopped looking like this luxury service and we opened up to create opportunity for folks that we normally wouldn't see on our platform. And so by adding that bit of versatility into our product, we actually became more accessible. I'll throw in one other example where we built technology here in the States for deaf individuals, so folks who are hard of hearing. So maybe if you've taken an Uber, you might have had somebody have a sign that pops up on your phone that says this person might be deaf. What we found was not only was it helpful for individuals who are deaf, but apparently people who are immigrants as well were leveraging this technology, right, in order for them to continue to maintain their points. And non-surprisingly, people who also didn't want to talk to anybody. We're switching on the deaf features. So. Multiple uses and looking at these underrepresented communities.
Yeah, can I add on to that really quickly? Because I do think that the feedback loop between underrepresented users currently on your platform and the people that are actually building the thing, right? The designers, those that are building the algorithms, that loop is usually a little bit broken. And so a similar example, we were getting user feedback from women of color on Pinterest that were saying, look, when I'm searching, the results that are coming up don't look anything like me. And in fact, over half of our searches around skin tone, people were qualifying that to even find the things that were relevant to them. And so essentially, we got the voices of a number of women of color users, got together with our product managers and our engineers, and actually built a tool that provided an inclusive search experience. But because those groups weren't talking to each other initially, we wouldn't have even made that discovery. Mm. And I think that to your question earlier on how do you scale those conversations internally, I also think there's often a really broken feedback loop internally for employees that are experiencing issues that might not be tangible to, like this is harassment, but it might be these subtle micro behaviors, like, hey, when I talk in a meeting, everyone starts looking at their phone and gets on their computer. Those little moments that people have nowhere to go to except amongst their friends, mm-hmm. that needs to become much more of a system. So whether it's you're building out an employee relations group or creating liaisons within different departments on the leadership team, those are the kinds of feedback loops that need to exist more.
Jules, I want to hear a little bit about Slack. We had Stuart Butterfield, Slack co-founder, here at Wisdom 2.0 a few years ago. And one of the things that really struck me about Slack is that the product itself is changing the nature of work. It's sort of breaking down hierarchical communication, making information more accessible throughout an organization. And it was interesting to hear Stuart talk a little bit about that phenomenon. So I'm curious, within the walls of Slack, like, how does this come up in terms of the product? Like, are there features within Slack that are specifically built to improve inclusion? And does this conversation happen within Slack? And how do you think about that?
Yeah. So the product reflects some of our values, one of which is around transparency. And in Slack, we have these channels where you can have work conversation, and by default, they're public. And that's a very intentional decision because typically in companies, you have important conversation happening in the rooms, and those information is not really trickled down. The other thing is, as an example, we had an article a few years ago for our platform where when we launched the platform, we had this hand in one of our illustrations, and it was the hand of, it was a darker tone hand to sort of emphasize that we're not like your typical enterprise company where, this typical, wider illustrations, but rather like we want to have more inclusive tones, like inclusive emojis, and so on. So this is something that's really important to us. It's both in terms of our culture, and the product. And I have seen how it plays in how we work. When I work with coworkers, there are people that are very vocal in Slack, but when we meet in person, we don't really share much. So going back to the point that you were saying earlier, and I think having tools that really think about different people preferences and communication style is really important, and that's one of the things that we really keep in mind.
And just to add to that, I really feel like when you do think about designing, building environments within your company or within the products like I work on, your radius of scale and influence is so large, right? So imagine here we are developing something that can actually touch the entire world, right? And you have these companies like Slack and Pinterest who are conscious about these things within their companies. How will that reflect to others outside who are operating? They're going to have a bigger radius of influence and literally touch more people across the world because they have people who are different within their platforms who are helping out, because they're thinking about this from a hiring standpoint, from a product standpoint, from a management standpoint, and so it's really, really important to understand that not only does it help with the rest of the world, but I want to also add that it actually also will help with folks that you may not think about, like white males in certain cases. So for example, when I talk about inclusiveness, it's not about just designing for someone that looks like me, right? It's about why are there not baby changing stations in men's rooms, right? It's about making sure that we take into account building something that's inclusive of everyone.
I have a question for you, Nancy. Slack had the opportunity to be a company that sort of grew up with some of these values and ideals from the get-go, whereas Uber has gone through a transformation over the last couple of years. They have sort of famously rehabilitated the culture there, or in process of rehabilitating it. We only know what we read. And I think there are sort of spirals that companies can get into. So I've heard people say that you can't hire any women because you don't have any women. You sort of get to a point of no return in terms of sort of homogeneity of culture. But from all appearances, Uber is on the upswing and improving internally the culture there. Can you comment on that? Can you just talk a little bit about Uber's culture? And if you can't, that's okay too. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
it's okay. I think it's really important to know that a lot of the things that people were hearing about Uber is not a solo Uber experience thing, right? In fact, when you think about the folks that are hired from this company, right, they're coming from the Googles, the Facebooks, a lot of these companies, right? So it's really just a culture issue in general where, the tech industry was developed by these, tech bros. And I joke that it's almost like they thought they knew what was going on in a frat, so they threw in some ping pong and free food and said, well, that'll get them, right? And so I think that everyone has woken up in the last few years. As you can see, like every company has been on fire for something related to not thinking inclusively about some of these things. And so I think it's I will say that Uber did do something that a lot of tech companies did not do. They hired Robert Holder, the old Attorney General, to actually investigate us and put out a report. And then we had statements that were available for everyone outside the company to hold us responsible to changing culture. And so, to an extent, they decided to own it and take responsibility for it and do something about it. And so I think that's really exciting to see that instead of shooing it away and saying, oh, we don't have a problem, what? Right? They're actually saying, all right, well, let's try to be the example, right? So I would say that out of all the tech companies, I mean, as a black woman, I'm just used to situations that may be a little bit uncomfortable in general. Doesn't matter what tech company I'm at. So Uber was no different to me than going to like an IBM, right? But I did notice that they do have a little bit more diversity there, which was a bit surprising to me. But it makes also sense to me when you're developing in over 75 countries. You kind of have to make sure that your team really represents like the globe.
That's really encouraging that through will and effort and accountability, you can actually make change. And I guess that was a question I had for the whole panel. Like, this has come to the fore, you know, in terms of attention, and yet we see it's very slow to make progress and actually move the needle in terms of numbers. And it can get exhausting and disheartening to sort of see this much attention hasn't really resulted in change yet. Can you comment as to whether or not that's true and why we should have, or should we have, reason to believe that change is going to come?
So I can start. I do think that change is happening. I know that's very broad. I think it's slower than anyone would like, and I don't think it's guaranteed. As in, I think we can regress in a hot second, because even though there's so much attention to the topic of diversity, the how and the why of how to progress it has been very slow. In fact, a lot of the attention has been name and shame, right? It's been like, you know, almost like a witch hunt of who's doing more terrible than the other person. And honestly, not a lot of media attention to solutions. Like, maybe solutions are boring because a lot of it is, you know, things like having accountability for culture. Like the Holder Report, for example, was a model that lots of different companies could use around accountability, around reporting, issues of harassment, and things like that. So I often say that even though there's a lot of attention, the attention isn't directed towards progress. And so a lot of companies will be in this kind of first stage, which is like, okay, accelerate. Diversity equals hiring. Let's just go. Let's just throw a lot of money at bringing in a lot of different people. It's very rare that that attention is focused on how to, again, create that feedback loop between your underrepresented users and your culture, or the feedback loop between your underrepresented employees and management. Because, you know, frankly, management is a lot less diverse than the people that are being hired in these early initiatives. And so I think that I would like to see more attention given to the how and the processes, and not in some kind of media headline that's sensationalist, but something that's really substantial and tangible.
Yeah. One thing I'll add is I've been at various companies, and I've only seen a difference when the CEO cares, and in no other context. And the other thing is, even when people care, it does take some time for change to happen. And I think what might be an inflection point for the industry is when we see more and more companies that are, you know, working on being more inclusive and diverse be super successful. Because the way Silicon Valley works is really pattern recognition, you know, move fast, break things, therefore let's all do that. So I think as we see more and more companies be successful and diverse and inclusive, I think then others will follow.
And I would say I would agree that there are incremental changes happening, but I will also say that it's impressive to me that things have changed, right? There are 3 black people on a stage at Wisdom 2.0, right? That's amazing, right? And I just think it's phenomenal that people are figuring it out, and people are thinking consciously about this, and they're reaching out to us and saying, let's diversify, let's be an example for the rest of the world. So very appreciative of that, yeah.
Well, on that note, to Jules' point, you know, you are each representing 3 incredibly successful companies, and you're each incredibly successful in your own right and incredibly generous. You do a ton of work beyond your day jobs to help share so generously this message to lift the industry and everyone. So let's thank them for the panel.